This show is brought to you by Safety FM.
Hi listeners, this is Brent Sutton. Welcome to the 56th episode of the Practice of Learning Teams podcast show. One of the great opportunities I have is being able to connect and talk with a variety of people who are both passionate and determined to make a difference in the new view of safety. I was presented with a unique opportunity to get together with the authors of the new book, Critical Steps, Managing What Must Go Right in High-Risk Operations, which is being published by CRC Press and due for release on November the 17th, and it will be available on Amazon in hardback, paperback and Kindle version. The book was authored by Tony Mascara, Ron Farris and Jim Marinis. All of these fine gentlemen have a long history in human and organisational performance and careers in the military. When I started my own journey in the new view of safety, one of my early reads was Risk-Based Thinking by Tony himself. The theme of the book reflects the title. Critical steps happen every day at work and at home purposefully. Work does not happen otherwise. If an operation has the capacity to do work, then it has the capacity to do harm. Work is energy directed by human beings to create value. But people are imperfect. We make mistakes and sometimes we lose control of the work. Therefore, work is the use of force under conditions of uncertainty. A critical step is a human action that will trigger immediate, irreversible, and intolerable harm to an asset if that action or a preceding action is performed improperly. Whether the human action involves clicking on a link attached to an email message, walking down a flight of stairs with a newborn baby in arms, engaging the clutch on a gasoline-driven chainsaw, or administering a medication to a patient in hospital, all these satisfy the definition of what constitutes critical risks in our daily lives, professionally or personally. The overarching goal of managing critical steps is to maximize the success of people's performance in the workplace to create value for the organisation without losing control of built-in hazards necessary to create that value. This book is great. It is so pleasing to see more bodies of work in the new view of safety that are focused on the how and the when rather than the what and the why. Not only is the book great, we also had fun with Tony, Ron and Jim during the recording of the podcast. The 30-minute pod turned into nearly 2 hours of purposeful conversation. Today's pod is the first in a series with the 3 authors. I was inspired by Jim's virtual background, and the backing soundtrack is called Rocky Mountain View as a fitting tribute to the 3 amigos. Please sit back and enjoy this conversation on critical steps with Tony, Ron and Jim. What was the inspiration? What made you lose part of your lives to write a book? Because book writing is not easy.
No. Let me jump on that. When I was back at the Institute of Nuclear Power Operations, back at IMPO here in Atlanta, we started I don't know if you're familiar with IMPO documents, but one of which is a good practice. I started a book, not a book, but a good practice, a long article, if you will, on self-checking, a human performance tool called self-checking. And this was back in 1990, 1991. And the question came up, when do you use self-checking? And so I started researching, okay, what are the occasions that you would want to use this technique? Stop, think, act, review. And the idea of critical steps popped up during that discussion with the other nuclear power plants. at the time. And we didn't call it critical steps, but something similar. I can't even remember what we called it back then. And then it came up again when in the mid 1990s when we wrote the principles document, Excellence in Human Performance. And so this was back 1997, 98 timeframe. And we actually called it critical steps. And I started cogitating on that, and I found an article written by some, I think, consultants. I'm not sure who they were, but it's been a while, on hazardous steps and critical steps at the Pantex nuclear weapons handling facility in Texas. And I would guess, you could anticipate that there are plenty of critical steps in handling nuclear weapons. And so I read their article, and that's how I got the inspiration that maybe the nuclear industry could benefit from this idea that there are certain actions, human actions, that if you don't do them right the first time, serious things can happen. And so that's where I got the idea. And then about 2 years ago, Ron, I wrote the book Risk-Based Thinking, and that was published by Routledge in 2018. That's right. And just as you said, writing a book is hard. And I told myself I'm never going to write a book again. But my passion for this topic, it was one of the chapters in Risk-Based Thinking, Critical Steps, and I thought, we could add a lot more to that concept. And I asked Ron, what do you think? And Ron's all for it. And so I figured it would be a lot easier to write a book with a co-author. And then I offered it to Jim, said, Jim, what do you think? And Jim was interested. So we added Jim to the mix. And then COVID happened. So COVID kind of made it easy for us to get together on a regular basis.
And I think more and more this concept of collaborating, which, if you think about it, is really at the heart of what we're trying to do with things like hop and learning teams. Isn't it a great idea?
It makes so much sense. And Jim, at first when we started talking about critical steps and putting meat on the bones, this idea of conversations came up, and I kind of pushed back. Well, Jim would probably say I didn't really I really pushed back hard.
not hard.
But Jim finally won that argument, and it made sense that conversations, the relationships between people in the workplace is really important when it comes to getting things right the first time.
Tony wanted to keep the book short, and to go into conversations was going to add meat, I think was his
Yeah, originally my goal was to keep the book less than 110 pages. And what did we end up with, Jim? About 165 or so. So I kept pushing back. This is adding too many pages to our book.
Well, and I should pitch in here a little bit too. That the inspiration for me, I had worked at IMPO with Tony way back. He and I never got to work together, but we were there at the same time. And when I left, I followed some of the work that he and others were doing. And when I saw critical steps, I was managing research operations at the time, and it aligned very well with what we were trying to do in the research community to define that box that research had to be conducted in, and then those things within that box that could create bad outcomes. And when Tony asked me to pitch in on this book, I said, great, because there's some translation still that would help folks. And so I was thrilled.
And, for me to join in the team, I had taken Tony's risk-based thinking book and scribbled all over it, as many folks have done, I can imagine. And the critical steps section was absolutely my favorite, along with the risk important actions. And and then of course controls, barriers, and safeguards. And so I resonated with the content. And when he asked me to, come on board and co-author, I thought, what a great opportunity to learn. You think you're imparting wisdom, and what you find is you spend a tremendous amount of time studying so you can write. And so we all had a big learning curve, obviously learning from each other and then learning from other great authors in this area of managing risk and high reliability and human performance. And so what a great opportunity to kind of add to that body of knowledge. And for me, the bigger pivotal moment really was when Tony said, I want to make this a practical guide. Mm-hmm. I don't want this to be an academic exercise. And the moment he said that, he hooked me, because I've read a lot of stuff. I really enjoyed reading it, but I always end every one of those books with the thought, boy, wouldn't it be nice if there was a guide on how to implement?
Oh, look, gentlemen,
that's what we tried to do.
I would so agree. I'm getting so tired of the what and the why versus the how and the when.
Yeah, exactly.
And that's the way I describe it. And when I caught up with Todd, the last time I saw him was in July 2019 in Auckland. He'd come down this way just for a meal. So well, you know, Todd, I could lure him with a box of Tim Tams, his favourite. So we got him down here, and he was teasing me about writing a book, and I said, well, look, if we do it, it's going to be about the practice of it.
Right.
We've got to move away from the theory and the science, and we've got to move into the practice.
And I can corroborate that because I've read your book.
Yeah, and it was really interesting. I mean, so once again, we personally felt that how could you write a book about learning teams without it being a learning team?
Exactly.
And Todd said, he said it's either going to be the worst idea ever, and it's going to be terrible, or it's going to be great. And it was interesting that we ran a learning team to map out the framework for the book.
I like it.
Nice.
And the book was a 90% match to the framework.
Mm-hmm. That's the way to do it. Ours was not. We didn't necessarily use a learning team, did we? It was more of a knockdown, drag out fight.
Well, yeah. I mean, you just embraced. We call it diversity of thought. You just embraced the fact that you had different views, and I think that's the key thing. And I think that's what readers like. They like to see different views, and they like to see those different views.
I don't think it was a knockdown, drag out fight.
That's a hyperbole.
We had strong opinions expressed with emotion
and respect.
Definitely. And that's why we continue to write together, right?
And that's why we're still friends.
Yeah.
Afterward,
there was a lot to do to bring in some of the science that has good foundation, but in a practical way. And those were the points where the friction existed. But I think we worked through it very successfully.
Oh,
yeah, we had some conversations about some of the hyphenated words that you see in academic references, and there was a couple of times I just simply put my foot down and said that word's not going in this book.
Well, the reason I mainly buy Kindle books is so I can look the word up while I'm reading it. Because half the stuff I get, I look at it and go, what do they mean by this?
Yeah. Well, we do have a glossary. We did put a glossary in the book.
A big one.
Yeah. A big one. Yeah.
Because it is a new vocabulary for some people. And
look, it's scary. It's scary. But I think there is that desire of people to want to learn and want to do more. And I tip my hat to you guys, because you have really addressed something that's not been spoken about very well. And I think you balance up that sort of mapping it out for people, but also creating that narrative around it to help people understand. Because I would agree, Jim, what you're saying before about, conversation drives context.
Mm-hmm.
Context is so important from a risk management and decision-making, perspective. We constantly see that the ability for people to reflect and see how they exist within the system is just becoming so more important.
Yeah.
Yeah, one of the folks that endorsed our book, Stephen Newell from National Safety Council. That's a non-government organization that's focused on safety, and he was formerly with ORC HSC, but now
Yes.
they're part of National Safety Council here in the United States, and Steve has gone as far as say that this is the next level of safety. And so we really feel that there's some practical, useful information that workers can use in real time. And this is going back to inspiration. This is information you can use with your children at home. Yeah. These concepts apply at home anywhere where there's human activity. So if you do work, whether it's for fun or for pay, or as an employee, these concepts of critical steps and risk important actions apply.
And what I like is that you're evolving HOP as well, which is really fascinating from my point of view.
Yeah, it's part and parcel to the risk perspective that we're trying to portray or pass on through critical steps. One of the things that I think Ron, I can't remember whether it was Ron or Jim, but they added the idea of failing safely. And that was a part that was really, I hadn't done a whole lot of thinking about that, but if a critical step doesn't go right, what do you do?
Mm-hmm.
How can you design your system or your technology to respond to those conditions, those situations where, what if you do make a mistake at a critical step? So that's an important aspect to the book as well.
I had seen Todd Coughlin up in Toronto at Human Performance Root Cause and Trending HPRCT conference. Of course, they've changed their name now, but and he spoke quite a bit about this concept of failing safely. And so one of the things Jim did for us in the book is he sent Todd the definition. We came to an agreement on what that definition was. And then we wrote quite a bit about it. And I give an example in the book and one of the stories of some workers that were dealing with this concept. And I'll tell you, most folks going into any kind of pre-task discussion, whether they call it a pre-job briefing or whatever it might be, there's a big assumption that two things. One, that people actually know what must absolutely go right, which is not true. They don't. If you asked everybody independently and they wrote it down, you'd be surprised where all the answers are. That's a problem, right? We need to bring everybody together in that discussion. And this is where conversations come in, as Jim will allude to. And then the other one is, and if it doesn't, then what and by who? Mm-hmm. Right? Like, what are those discrete actions? Because that's not the moment in time you have time to have a discussion. So you have to have a mental model about how to fail safely and who will do what when it does fail. Mm-hmm. Because now we have either a source of energy, some movement of mass, or transmission of information that is out of control. It's out there causing damage to one of our assets. And the idea is that we have to put together some mental model as a team to handle that upset. So, at both ends of that discussion, you've got what must go right, and if it doesn't, then what? And what I thought was most interesting, kind of profound, that we came to is this idea that, there's literally a finite set of things that must go right in a task, but there's an infinite possibility and combination of things that can go wrong. And when you ask workers, they'll go down all kinds of rabbit holes. Well, if you bring them back to the concept of what must go right, and if it doesn't, then you narrow that focus down, right? And we got to narrow that focus down so you have a better discussion.
Yeah, because
I think that's...
Go for it, Jim. Sorry.
Go ahead, Brent.
Well, no, because you're talking about a recipe for success.
Yes.
Yeah.
And, you know, I always say to people, is safety, is it an art form or is it a science? And I think for workers, it's actually an art form.
Mm-hmm.
Very much.
Yeah, not a science. They don't look at it as a science. And I think they're trying to be,
especially.
yeah, well, they're trying to be as effective and as efficient as they can be. And as we talked about before, they're trying to fight acceptance bias. They're trying to fight the fact that they're being told every day that if this goes wrong, this is going to be the outcome. But it doesn't go wrong often.
Nope.
One of the things, go ahead, Jim, you were jumping in there.
Well, what I wanted to say was that one of the breakthroughs for us was when we were speaking this way amongst ourselves. Towards the end of the book, we were sending preprint copies out for review, get input and see if we're on a good track, etc. And I sent it to a few operations leaders. And the feedback we got from those folks is, well, one of them actually just came out and said, why are you calling this a safety book? This is an operations book.
Mm-hmm.
And that was a breakthrough. Because, in fact, one of the shortcomings of many of the current works out there is that it is written from a safety perspective. And the users, many in the field, look at that and they go, well, you're only giving me part of this big picture. What's the rest of the story? And what was pointed out to us by some of the reviewers is that we were writing that rest of the story. We're calling it an emphasis on safety, but in fact, we're describing operations.
Right.
And if you look at the support for the operations community out there, it is very slim.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Most of the conferences are not operations focused. Most of the publications are not operations focused. And so being able to look at it from the perspective of the frontline worker, who is the integrator of all of those aspects, and write it such that it's understandable for them, is where we were really trying to go. And that's part of why we ended up talking conversations fairly significantly.
Yeah, the operation is very, very important. In fact, the original title was Critical Steps, Managing What Must Go Right. And CRC Press came back and they said, I think the first time we submitted it to them, it had in high-risk operations. And we took that off and decided, well, let's keep the title short, managing what must go right, period. So they said we need to add that in high-risk operations because it is operations focused. And by the way, just so you know, all three of us are former Navy nuclear operators. Two of us were on submarines and one of us was on an aircraft carrier. And but we all have operations in our blood. In the blood,
yeah, it's inherent. And look, and I think also putting that word high risk operations also broadens your search appeal when the book gets released as well. Because that's what
what they.
Oh yeah. It's all about the marketing, which is the objective. But I think overall, I mean, you're providing people, and once again, we have this. There's this constant argument about a tool versus a framework. And I think what you guys are doing is you're providing a framework for people.
It's a way of thinking.
Correct. Yeah, it's not a tool as such. And people can, if they like, take that thinking and then apply it in different ways. And some of that systemization may end up as a tool. But I think sometimes this whole concept of systemization is being touted as a dirty word. But as humans, we have to systemize. We want to systemize.
Absolutely.
Yeah. we big picture of the book, we kind of worked our way into this as we were working on the book, but obviously the overarching strategic purpose of the book was to manage critical steps, managing what must go right. But then we realized we had to break it down. What are we really doing? Objective. What are the sub-objectives of accomplishing that? And one, you can't manage it unless you can identify it. So first, you have to identify what are these opportunities, these critical steps. And there's some that are hidden. There are hidden critical steps. We call those landmines, and we talk about that in the work in the book. But then the second objective is once you know what the critical steps are, how do you exercise positive control over those? How do we exercise control over the transfer of energy, over the movement of matter? How do you control the transmission of information so that it accomplishes what the organization wants to accomplish, but at the same time avoid the harm if we lose control? And that was the third objective. The third objective was if we do lose control, and this goes back to Ron's point of exercising how to fail safely. And there was a fourth objective. We realized there was a fourth objective, which came up when we started talking about rolling it out. That's chapter 8. How do you roll this out? Is we need to align the organization to support the first three objectives.
Yep.
So the organization has to be set up, and managers have to think, like you're suggesting. It's a way of thinking about the risk that everyday work poses to the things that are important to the organization, namely assets. And that's what an event is. An event is defined by the level of harm to an asset. And so the managers need to learn to think this way as well as the frontline workers.
So going back to a point that Ron mentioned, I think it's pretty important from the design of the book perspective, and that is that traditional high-risk operations today usually spends time avoiding what could go wrong.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And the focus on managing day-to-day is in anticipating what can go wrong, managing to prevent it. The focus on event investigation is on determining what went wrong. And the focus of procedure emphasis is frequently preventing failure. But when you get right down to the practice of critical steps, it takes the emphasis away from avoiding failure and puts it on ensuring success.
Mm-hmm.
The clarity that helps provide in an operation can be significant.
Yeah. And one of the things we did in the book here that I thought was extremely important is we actually provide the readers the discrete elements of risk important actions and critical steps in such a way that they recognize and how to define those within the task or the evolution, and we build that framework so that they know how to do it and very distinctly what differentiates those things. Because one of the things that I have found out in the field, and I know these guys have as well, is that quite often folks will over-define things to be critical steps. And the problem is if everything's important, then nothing's important or equally unimportant, right? And that's such a bad place to be. Knowing that pivotal moment when when the evolution has a point of no return, when you have that potential for a release in an uncontrolled manner due to human error, either in the past or in the current, is so important. And then knowing the other thing that I thought, and we kind of came to it at the end, we kind of having an epiphany, and we were having a discussion about risk important actions, and we recognized there was a term we were missing in the book, and we added it and defined it well, and then didn't change the whole lot in the book because we were on the 11th hour of getting the book printed. But it was the idea of risk important conditions. Mm-hmm. And that you're not necessarily going to go back and look at every single risk important action to say I'm ready to take the critical step, well, what are the conditions it should have created to create the safety? So when I take that action, I know that the outcome is going to be what I expect, not some unknown or with some potential. And those conditions may have multitudes of risk important actions, but you're only checking one condition. You're not going back and checking hundreds of potential actions. And I thought that moment in time, I thought, wow, I walked away learning something out of our debate and discussion. And I'm pretty sure Tony brought this one up, and we decided to put it in. I don't know, Tony, did you get that out of some training you had done, and it made you think about it? I forget where you came up with the idea.
Well, the question I always ask my clients is, what must be true in order to perform a specific action without consequence? What are the conditions that have to be set before you perform the critical act? It's like jumping out of an airplane. I mean, what must be true before you do skydiving? You got to have a parachute on.
Yeah.
You got to have a parachute that's been packed correctly, and you know how to deploy it.
That's right. You know where the pull cord is.
So all those things, and plus you got to have it secured around your body. So there's a number of things that have to be set before you jump across that open door of the aircraft.
Yeah, and what I like is that effectively the language I used is that you're creating what I call a risk rationale for workers.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's a good example where you've recognized that there's a difference between how the organization views something versus how workers view something.
Oh, yeah.
And that you're trying to really support workers in making those good outcomes, or creating those good outcomes through that sort of reflective practice where you're trying to get them to think about the present, not the past.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, yeah.
I was going to add, going back to Ron made a mention that sometimes people call too many things critical steps.
Yeah.
And I go back to the example, well, you need a hard hat on, you may need eye protection or gloves on because there's pinch points. Yeah, those are the conditions that need to be created before you do the work. Those are what we call the risk important action. But putting on the gloves, putting on the eye protection, those are the risk important actions. All right, to create those conditions. But people would especially frontline workers would call those critical steps. They just really didn't understand. It's like going back to the firearms in the analogy. It's everybody who watches any kind of movies, Hollywood movies, have seen people shoot firearms, handguns, whatever. And the critical step is always pull the trigger. Pulling the trigger is the critical step. Well, what are those risk important conditions? A cartridge in the chamber, hammers pulled back, the finger inside the trigger guard, so on. But I can always unload the gun. I can always put the safety on. I can always point the muzzle away from a target. Those are all risk important action conditions, and I can undo those. They're reversible, but a critical step is irreversible.
Yeah, because it leads on for that. We're just finalising a new white paper with Todd Conklin at the moment about everyday learning as part of extension of learning teams. And, Todd coined that phrase sticky, stuff that can kill you. And when we've been engaging with workers, we have a thing called STRM, stuff that really matters.
Yeah.
and workers can tell you about the stuff that really matters. And no surprising.
I've heard it used differently, but it's the same acronym.
Yeah, but no surprise that what the workers think and what the organization thinks is different.
Yeah.
So a neat aspect that goes right along with this conversation, it's pretty common for high-risk industry to have a risk register these days. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And the reason they do it is for board review. They do it for organizational alignment, etc. But there's a bit of a dichotomy, and it's been brought about by substantial regulation, peer pressure, seeking excellence, and to go back to Ron's point, lots of things are important, and the tendency is to add to that list. If we can do this well, we should be able to do that well too. One of the things that this type of thinking does is it gives the corporation a way to bridge that dichotomy gap there between the risk register, which is on purpose actually very short, and the number of things that they put a lot of resources into managing. Because when you have that hierarchy, you know what the critical steps are, and you can see that they will align with the risk registers. Mm-hmm. You can now start de-emphasizing some things that you may be, in fact, spending a lot of resources on, because you now are aligning the critical steps, the risk register, with the practices in the field.
Well, I think it makes the ability, we call efficacy of controls. So the ability to go out and check for the presence of controls and mitigations, it makes it much stronger.
Yes.
I think that's what you're really saying, because I always say to people that you're either your mitigations or your controls, your barriers, whatever language we use, you're either trying to manage that release of energy that you talked about, Ron, things getting out, or you're trying to influence the person who, to be honest, is actually the only person who is exposed to residual risk. Because if you think about it, whatever risk remains, that's what the worker faces, not the organisation.
Right.
And when we think about the efficacy of those controls, we're really trying to say, well, what is that presence of capacity around managing that release of energy? And what is that, and I think I use this term, what is the resilience of the person existing in the system trying to deal with that residual risk? I don't know if that sort of resonates well with you guys.
Yeah, well, that's consistent with the idea of risk important conditions. What must be present so you can do this work without injury or harm, and still accomplish your organization's goals.
And conversely, what do you now pay less attention to because it's not useful in this situation? Bandwidth and the clarity of action is really benefiting.
Thank you, listeners, for being part of this podcast. We would love to hear your learnings or other topics you would like us to explore about learning teams. Go to www.podcastlearnings.com and give us your feedback. Become part of the community of practice with learning teams. Go to www.learningteamscommunity.com. Support the authors of the practice of learning teams. Purchase the book from Amazon.com or go to www.learningteamsbook.com for an inside look and other free book resources from the authors.
The views and opinions expressed on this podcast are those of the host and its guest and do not necessarily reflect the official policy or position of the company. Examples of analysis discussed within this podcast are only examples. They should not be utilized in the real world as the only solution available, as they are based only on very limited and dated open source information. Assumptions made within this analysis are not reflective of the position of the company. No part of this podcast may be reproduced, stored in a retrieval system, or transmitted in any form or by any means, mechanical, electronic, recording, or otherwise, without prior written permission of the creator of the podcast, Jay Allen.